and welcome to episode 88 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
And this is Jon Dinning in Los Angeles.
Jon, how are things in Los Angeles?
Coming back to life, slowly but surely. But yeah, things are good, man. I got out and about, had some fun last weekend.
That's excellent to hear. I actually got out myself slightly. Went out and met with some people. Didn't get that close to them. At least I tried not to.
I thought you were going to say you went and got the mail or something. That's much more impressive. Look at you socializing.
Had to. It was a friend's birthday out here, and I didn't want to miss it. So I made sure to show up and be sociable.
Good. For my curiosity, what's the scene like? Most people still masking and distancing, or has everybody just forgotten the last year?
They appear to have forgotten everything, and they are acting as if, well, there's no possible return to problem or anything like that. So it was disturbing to me, but at the same time, I completely understand that mindset.
Yeah, I've seen a bit of a mixed bag around here, but it's mostly just people happy to be face-to-face again, and as close as possible face-to-face.
It was cool to see some faces that I hadn't seen in a while, and of course everybody's like, what, you're out? And I'm like, yes. But don't count on me being out all the time. It was really more of a one-shot thing.
I just thought it was cool to see faces. Much less recognizable ones. So, good for us, man. Reintegrating into society.
Now, you're really reintegrating because you're heading to Mexico this weekend, are you not?
Yeah, speaking of birthdays, two of my good Charleston buddies are both having a birthday. So we're heading down to Mexico City just for a long, boozy romp. Should be fun.
I think I know those friends of yours, too. Do I not?
You know a couple of them. There's 10 guys, which is 8 guys too many, going on this trip. And I know 2 of them.
Oh, nice.
So I'm going to make some friends or some enemies. We'll see what happens.
Enemies, most likely, knowing you.
Yeah, I'd say that's a safe bet.
So if you're heading to Mexico, what are you drinking tonight?
Well, so the first house guest that I had in a year departed but left me a present. She left me a bottle of really good mezcal. I think I'm going to butcher the name. It's spelled or looks like illegal, but I think it's illegal mezcal. It's a Neho bottle. And it's fantastic. So I've poured myself some on a rock, and I'm feeling festive. Feeling in the spirit.
Well, when I saw what you were drinking, I was like, I'm going to have a Corona because I've been on a beer kick recently.
I appreciate that.
In the spirit with you, have a fiesta down there. Enjoy yourself. I enjoy Mexico when I go, which hasn't been for a while, but it's always a fun time.
Gracias. You picked today's song. What is it?
I did. And the background on this, I think it's key to understand what the topic is tonight. We're actually going to talk about the LSAT scoring scale. And probably one of the most common misunderstandings that I see when people are talking about the LSAT is how the scoring scale actually works. So we're going to talk about a little bit of the background of it, talk about some of the myths that surround it, and hopefully keep it entertaining. But there is a song from a long time ago by the Offspring called Come Out and Play. And when you think about how a scoring scale works and what it does, it technically is keeping people separated on the scoring line. And there is the classic lyric in that song that says, you got to keep them separated. So to me, the straight line there was really clear. That's the song for tonight. It's a pretty good song. And I always give those guys a lot of credit because they're kind of like a punk band, but then they had the most catchy hooks that you could ever imagine.
I feel the same way about Green Day in a sense. It's more melodic than you'd think at a glance.
Yeah. Some of the Green Day songs are like, man, that really just gets in your head and it doesn't get out. And also the law firm that we have used over the years and originally had used was an entertainment law firm in Los Angeles, and they represented the Offspring. And so the attorney that worked on our cases and some of the stuff that we set up knew Dexter Holland from the Offspring. He also knew a whole host of, rock stars. He had some hilarious stories that he would tell.
I think you've told me something about Snoop Dogg that he was relaying to you.
I've heard stories about Axl Rose and Guns N' Roses being in the attorney's office at 3 a.m. This guy talking about going to Tool concerts, and he's like, have you ever been to a Tool concert wearing a suit? And I was like, neither of those things have occurred. So you don't have to worry about it. But he used to tell me stories about Dexter Holland being a really class act and just a generally really good guy. And he was always like, if you ever need anything from them, any kind of merch, anything signed, you guys want to do any kind of charitable stuff, he is down for it. So I don't have any problem supporting them.
Yeah, props to the Offspring. Well done.
Yeah. Well, before we keep them separated, let's get to the LSAT world. What's the next thing on the LSAT timeline?
Well, I suppose the next big ticket item is that there's an LSAT coming up in about 4 weeks, 4.5 weeks maybe. from when this will release. It begins on Saturday, August 14th, and the dates that have been announced so far are Saturday and Sunday, the 14th and 15th, and Tuesday, August 17th.
Yeah, and I believe there are also some accommodations tests on Thursday
Yeah,
of that week, especially the paper and pencil. Test takers usually have their own day just so they get the proctors who know what to do and how to handle that. And then they've made a little bit of a change to the sign up for your testing day and time. Previously, they'd been doing it 9 days in advance, which was kind of cool because they wouldn't tell people when it was coming, but we knew that what their policy was. And so we were able to kind of tell people, hey, this is when it's going to be.
Yeah.
They've actually made a much earlier announcement this time around it. And it's instead of being 9 days, it's going to be 16 days in advance. So if you are looking at your calendar and thinking, when do I sign up to pick a day and time? That is going to be on Thursday, July 29th. That will happen. And so keep an eye out for that. But that gives everybody an extra week, now 16 days before the test. And I know from talking to LSAC that their mindset on this was the more time people had to prepare and to pin down their schedule and to move around work shifts, the better off it's going to be. So they're trying to do a good thing here, and I agree it's a good thing.
Yeah, it's a great thing. I'll give you one additional benefit as a student, which is once you have your test time and date locked, you can start to take all your practice tests as relevant to that or as reflective of that as possible. This gives you a whole extra week to know when you're testing and then to, again, plan your practice test accordingly. So I'm a big fan of this. I hope it sticks around.
Yeah, we should come up with like an interface that we can put on the front of our digital tests that make you log in and sometimes randomly gives you like a 20-minute delay. Might be 5 minutes.
So, let's just hire Proctor U.
It's replicate the experience of logging in and what actually happens. Randomized time could be 20 minutes, could be 50 minutes. That would really be true to form. Most of the time, it's like 5 minutes, 10 minutes at most. So if you are taking a practice test at that time, just be aware of that being the case.
If we do implement that, I want you to know, for the blizzard of hate mail, I'm going to put your home address.
I would give people the opt-in, opt-out option.
Okay.
Like, do you want to play, the LSAT casino and see how long it does to check in, or do you just want it to work automatically? I wouldn't just enforce that upon everybody. They'd be really confused. Why does it take my practice test 30 minutes to start? Because sometimes the real thing takes 30 minutes to start. But more often than not, it happens pretty quickly.
Yeah. So yeah, that's coming up. What else we got?
I was going to say the other thing that we have seen in the last week or so is that LSAC released a blog that was of some interest for the first time in quite a while. That's on their famous law:fully blog, my favorite blog name to say out loud. And this one, I have to admit, when I saw it come out, it caught my eye. It was called Reflections on the 2021 Admissions Cycle. And I guess what I would say to people is go take a read of it. It's certainly an interesting read, and it distills a lot of LSAC's perspective on this. I also think that for the company that makes the LSAT, I don't know that I would have pushed some of the what I consider to be flawed arguments as hard as they did, but that's their narrative. And if you want to talk about some of the flaws that you see in that particular blog, feel free to post it on our forum. I'll probably respond. So something to keep in mind and see if you can spot the ones that I saw, because I saw a few that I consider egregious. And I don't think they need to, worry about revising history or kind of giving their take on it. There was a lot of positive things that they did, like creating the flex test and allowing people to actually have an option. I think they should have focused on that. I don't love what I'm seeing with a lot of numbers and percentages issues here. But Jon, we should probably not go too deeply on this because I know that I'll just become more and more eviscerating in terms of my commentary, and I'd like to avoid that.
This feels like one of those moments where you and I could very easily begin to escalate one another. I could say something to set you off, which would set me off, and before you know it, an hour's passed and we're both fuming.
Here's the thing. I look at it as the writings of one person, and I've seen some of the, comments that come out of the same source before, and I think it's a spin effort. Yeah. And so if you recognize it for what it is, then I think a lot of it is clear. I wish they wouldn't do that. I think that it's something where they feel compelled to. They want to give their version out. I think the version that actually is the truth, which is, boy, people studied a lot more. maybe we didn't get the scaling 100% right on this. I think that actually is a lot more compelling than maybe trying to gloss over some real issues here and to address them head on. But here I am. I'm starting down that path.
No,
so
I can feel it too. And I'll say this, so far you've been very diplomatic, and I'm proud of you.
I do my best.
All right, that's good.
Let's just say that I disagreed with a lot of what I was seeing, and it frustrated me a little bit to see it presented in the manner that it was.
Yeah,
And
it's
we'll move
irksome
on.
for a company that tests logic to apparently avoid their own good advice. But again,
I can
we got to be
make
careful.
several. Yeah, I can make several excellent LSAT questions that test flaws in the reasoning based upon the content there. And so we're going to move on.
Move on.
Let's talk about the main event, which I know some people are like, the LSAT scoring scale, that doesn't sound that interesting. And I always say, you know, what you don't know can harm you.
Mm-hmm.
And the more you understand about something as fundamental as the scoring scale, the better off you're going to be. And that is because every single person is going to deal with their own scoring scale. And if you don't understand what it is you're looking at, even in that period of time, if you're thinking about canceling or doing something like that, it's detrimental.
Mm-hmm.
You need to have an understanding of this because it controls your score to some extent, not 100% obviously, but it does have an impact on how your test is scored, how to perceive difficulty, all these different things. So to me, this is a really, really important topic. And I would imagine you agree.
Yeah, in fact, I'll add to that not only is this important and universally impactful, I would say this is probably on the Rushmore of LSAT misconceptions. The scoring scale is one of those things that everyone talks about and most people get wrong.
Yeah.
So we are here to set the record straight.
I love that. That's a perfect description of it. And interestingly enough, we've already decided that one of our upcoming episodes will be another Rushmore LSAT misunderstanding. And that's going to be the experimental section since it's returning in August.
That's right.
So let's talk about it.
Let's do it. Maybe start with some background. A lot of people are probably hearing us say scoring scale and lost at the jump.
Yeah, let's get into the background and then we'll get into the myths, which I think are a little bit more fun. But the background is really like the meat of this discussion. So what is a scoring scale? And what does it mean? That's where we really want to start. And if you think about it, it goes back to the song choice that I made with that lyric. It is a way to separate people out. And so if I look at one score versus another score from a law school perspective, they can rank applicants on that particular factor and many others. And what it does in LSAT terms is it ranks people on a consistent spectrum that for the most part, at least these days, the last 30 plus years has been really the same scale consistently put through there.
It might be the only thing that stayed the same during that period of time.
That's been very consistent. I'll have to think about anything else that might be that consistent, but aside from the type of topics that they test, logic games, logic reasoning, reading comprehension, I don't think so.
Yeah, question counts per section's been pretty steady. Yeah. But I mean, we're really having to reach for constancy here. The scoring scale, though, has stayed constant.
Yeah, and that's not a knock on LSAC. No. That's just things change, and that's the natural order of what occurs. But we know that the LSAT scoring scale has been the same for a long time now, decades, and it is a scale that goes from 120 to 180. This is not the only scoring scale that's ever been used for the LSAT. You go way back and you see 200 to 800, which is the same scale that you encounter on the tests like the SAT, for example.
The GMAT, yeah.
Yeah, and then there was a period of time where they used the scaling that was 10 to 48. And so there was, a good decade, really the 80s for the most part, where they used that particular scoring scale. So I've seen it move around over time, and they've gone to 120 to 180, and it's been that way the entire time that I've been doing this. But that started in June of 1991. And so sometimes you'll hear me and a few others refer to the modern era of the LSAT, and that's what that represents as the start of that new scale. And you think about what's the point of this scale? It's going to separate them out. How does it separate them out? It uses the classic bell curve that most people are familiar with, where when you line out the scores from 120 to 180 in individual increments by 1, and then you put the percentage of people on top of that, you end up with very few people at the top and the bottom, and then a lot of people in the middle. And when you graph that, it looks kind of like a big hump or a bell of some sort that's there.
Yeah, sort of an inverse parabola look. Everybody knows what a bell curve is, and if you don't, goodness.
You need to go learn it. But this allows them to normalize what's happening with the test. It conforms to this bell curve. And part of what their goal is, one of them at least, is to have these tests not individually, because they do vary somewhat, but on a collective level, kind of match that bell curve. They want consistent percentiles year over year so that law schools can say to themselves, I know what a 170 is going to be every year. I know what the 99th percentile is going to be every year. I know what the 60th percentile is going to be every year.
Right.
Now, is that perfect? No.
Of course not.
There is an error of measurement. It's called a SEM, standard error of measurement, on this test and all others as well. And so what they do is they actually add score bands. That's where this comes from.
Mm-hmm.
And for the regular LSAT, it's about plus or minus 3. So if you go out and get a 160, what they really say is, gee, that could be anywhere between a 157 and a 163. We're not totally sure, which sounds really squishy to me when I think about it.
It does, yeah. If you think about the error measurement there, the error allowance in that, that's quite a high degree of wiggle.
Yeah.
Between where you are. It's also why when people ask me a question like, man, I got a 160 on record, I think I'm going to get a 158 on this, is that going to really set me back? I'm like, no, that's actually considered more or less equivalent.
Yeah. You don't want to get into a slippery slope and then just keep walking down 2 points the whole way.
Right.
But this is why law schools they try not to get into this battle of, oh, this person got a 160, this other person got a 161. They don't think you're demonstrably better. So when you look at that, that's the regular LSAT, the old 5-section test. With the flex test, the 3-section test, my understanding was that the standard error of measurement actually increased and it had moved up to close to plus or minus 4.
Yeah.
So a little bit more variance, which makes some sense with some of the other things that we were seeing with the flex, which we're not really going to focus on today because we focused on that elsewhere, some of the problems with the scoring results there. But if you look at that scoring scale, Jon, and it goes from 120 to 180, there are 61 possible scores.
Right.
So you take this test, you're going to get one of 61 scores if you actually get a result here. How come they have it from 120 to 180? Why don't they have it from 0 to 60?
That's a good question. And we could ask the same thing about that old 10 to 48 scale, which almost feels nonsensical. Like they were just picking numbers out of a hat. I think part of the reason they do the 120 to 180, and this can't be the only, but part of it I think has to just be the psychological cushion of not having to tell your friends and family you got a 3 on the LSAT.
Which would suck.
Yeah, if they scored it from 0 to 61, somebody's going to get a 0. And man, that's rough. So at least a 120 sounds more prestigious to those who don't know.
Well, you could say it to someone who's unfamiliar with the LSAT and they might think it's your IQ and be like, oh, nice. And then, all of a sudden there's that connection there. But having to tell mom or dad or your significant other that, you got a 4 or a 2 or whatever, they're going to know automatically. That's probably not good now, is it? So that's one piece. And of course, the other thing is this, is that if you look at the 120 to 180 scale and you compare it to that SAT 200 to 800 scale, they're the same scales. All you do is you take 200 to 800, you chop off a 0 from the end and you put a 1 in front of it, and all of a sudden it's the same thing that you're used to. So I think what they did was they just kind of transformed something that everybody already was comfortable with to make it just a little bit more kind of like specialized to the LSAT.
Yeah, so a 176 LSAT's about a 760 in terms of the equation out of the 200 to 800. The better question, or at least to me, I think the more interesting question is, why only 61 possible results? I think everyone listening to this at this point knows there aren't 61 questions on the LSAT. In fact, there's not even that close to 61 questions.
Yeah, it's far more. So it's clearly not one question right means 1 point on the scaled score.
That's right.
If you know that the LSAT has anywhere from, say, 75 to 102 questions that we're aware of, that's far more than 61. So how do they get it down to just 61 different scaled scores there?
Let me put one quick point of clarification on what you just said. 75 or 76 is the scored 3-section test. 102 maximum questions was the old 4-section scored test that no longer exists as of this recording.
But used to be.
Exactly,
the case. But they all use the same scale.
3 decades, right?
Yeah, with all those tests, whether it was a flex or a regular old style LSAT, they all ended up on the 120 to 180 scale. So how did they do it, Jon?
Well, and this is where, like I said, I think it gets a little more interesting. You used the phrase a second ago, your scaled score from 120 to 180, and that's exactly what it is. They use a conversion chart that takes your raw performance on an individual test, and based on that test's unique conversion chart, they turn that raw number into a result, a scaled result from 120 to 180.
So what's the raw score based on?
Well, the raw score is based, that's a good question. Should have started there. The raw score is just simply the number of questions you've answered correctly.
Which is kind of cool because it means that every time you go through an LSAT, as you get a question right or you feel that you've gotten it right, you're able to say to yourself, all right, I'm increasing my raw score. It should be quite clear, though, that one question right does not mean one scaled score correct. And in fact, the way scaled scores work out typically, when you go into that conversion, you have to get a series of questions right first before you start lifting off from 120. So, and the other thing I'll point out is, unlike some tests in the past, there's no penalty for a missed question. So always guess on any questions you can't get right, because if you do happen to get it right, whether by intent or by guessing, it's still +1 to your raw score.
Yeah, don't leave anything blank on the LSAT. It's amazing how often I get that question. And I love that question because the answer is so simple.
Yeah, and it's so beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always said this about the way they make this test. They feel so strongly about its ability to predict performance, they're willing to allow you to guess. They don't even think that will make a difference, which is a very strong statement on their part. It also means that if you have a good day guessing and you get lucky that the test lines up with the guessing that you've chosen, and we've talked about that in other podcasts and certainly other blog articles, so I won't go into detail here, you can demonstrably change your score. You might get 5 or 6 guesses right, and all of a sudden that adds 5 or 6 to your raw score. That's going to change your scaled score for sure as you're going through this. Now, let's just use an example. Let's use the May 2020 LSAT scoring scale, and we'll talk about the raw score and how it gets converted to a scaled score. And I think it's really interesting because that test had 76 total questions on it. If you got anywhere from 0 questions to 15 right, your score was 120.
Mm-hmm.
So getting that 10th question right and then the 11th and the 12th, it wasn't moving your score. It was getting to the point where your score was going to start moving. And so that's actually at the point where now you've got pretty close to 60 questions left, and it starts to move almost 1-to-1. There are jumps that go through this. But from 0 to 15, you're getting a 120 on that.
I'll point out, too, 15 right is more or less what you would expect to happen if people blind guess their way through. That's exactly 1/5 or right at of the total questions. So you could not on that test, without a bit of luck, guess your way past a 120.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's a really good point. That's part of the reason they can say, well, look, pure guessing isn't going to do anything for you. Of course, we never talk about pure guessing. We always talk about calculated guessing,
Informed
using
guessing, that's right.
Information from the past to kind of like predict what's going on. So if you're like, what are you talking about now? Go listen to the podcast that we did about guessing strategy, because it is a cool one. And I'd say that we irrefutably proved that guessing will typically give you some benefits, and there are certain things that you do want to guess.
Sure.
But as you go up that scale, you get 21 right on that test, you're going to get a 131. You get 28 right, you get a 140. Notice how I only went up 7 questions, but I went up 9, 10 points there. And it kind of keeps on going up. You get 39 right, you get a 150. You get 54 right, you get a 160. When you get to the top level of the scale, you need 67 questions right to get a 170. So you can miss 9 questions on that test, which is relatively loose in our estimation.
Yeah, it was.
And that'll give you 170. To get a 180, you either have to get them all right, or you can miss at most 1 question. So you got to get 75 or 76 to get a perfect score on that. But that is the conversion chart in a very quick kind of synopsis form for the May 2020 test.
Mm-hmm.
as we will talk about, these conversion charts change from exam to exam. That's just May's conversion chart. It's a nice guide, but it does
Right.
not mean that every other test has the same conversion chart. But when we talk about this, missing 1 to get a 180, missing 9 to get a 170, this is what you hear people talking about after the test where they say, what's the curve?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just kind of like, put a nomenclature comment to the side. It's not a real curve. It's not based upon the performance on the test, as we'll talk about. So it's not a true curve,
Mm-hmm.
but everybody uses that because it makes so much sense. Like, how does it move around? So it's really the scaling for the test, but everybody uses curve interchangeably. And even though I would argue that it's not the exact right descriptor,
Right.
it works for me. I don't care.
Yeah, it's not the grade curve that you maybe saw in college classes or something where just that group of people in the room with you are going to determine how the professor grades it. It's just slightly broader than that and different. I want to draw people's attention to one, and again, I'm choosing this somewhat arbitrarily, but look at that jump, that 10-point jump from a 150 to a 160. You had to get 15 more questions right to make a 10-point improvement there. And the reason why, once again, the simple math of it is that's where most people live, is towards the middle of this, and there are more questions than there are outcomes. So with 76 questions and 61 results, it's going to take at some point more questions right, 1 or 2 each time, to go a single point up. And that to me is a pretty good thing. You got to get literally 15 for 10.
And let's make the comparison there. It's 15 questions to go from 150 to 160. It's only 9 questions to go from 170 to 180.
I was hoping that's where you'd go.
Yeah. And so what's happening there is that the separation in the 170s, there's fewer people. So one question will move you over enough people to move your score up typically. Whereas in that 150 to 160 range, each point represents a much bigger percentage of people. So they're not going to give you that jump just from one question. You have to work harder to go from 150 to 160 in terms of the number of questions answered correctly.
Yeah.
When compared to 170 to 180.
I think for some people that feels a little demoralizing. If you're sitting at a 150, it feels like you've got a much, steeper or taller hill to climb than if you're sitting at a 170. Your 10 points take 15 more right than the 170 person's 10 points. However, let me give you some motivation, because this is what I always think about. I think about it in terms of percentiles. That move from a 170 to 180 might change you 4%. That move from a 150 to a 160, though, I could change you 30+% in terms of your competition. It's enormous.
Also consider it from the perspective of the opportunity. When you're sitting at 150, you've got a number of questions that you've missed that you can now correct going forward.
That's a great point.
When you're sitting at 170, the number of misses that you have to correct is far fewer. The standard in terms of performance is much higher. So you may have to get 15 right, but you've got a lot more opportunities to get those 15 right than you do when you're sitting at 170. You're not going to have 15 misses at 170 if that's the score that you have. So you don't have that many opportunities.
That's a good point, yeah. So there you go. For any 150 listeners, there's a lot to take heart in.
Definitely. So if this is the case, when we look at these tests and we know that each one has its own conversion chart, its own curve, and it changes from test to test, why are there all these different curves? Why are they doing this? Why are they matching different scales to different tests here? What's actually happening?
I think
What's the point of it?
part of the answer is in the name. This is a standardized test, so they need the results of any given LSAT to be comparable and equatable to those from other tests. You wouldn't want law schools to have to sit there and not only look at your score, but look at your test administration to evaluate that score through. So part of this curving process is just to have people over time being considered equivalent in terms of what their results mean.
Yeah, the entire goal here is to have a score on any LSAT be comparable to the same score from another LSAT.
That's right.
This is a process known as equating. We talked about normalizing the test, which is to create that bell curve distribution. They also equate exams so that it doesn't matter when I take it. I could take the June test, I get a certain score. You take a test that's later on in the year, say in August, you get the same score. They want it to be so that those two results mean the same thing in terms of performance.
Yeah.
And
interestingly enough, these days we could both take the August test, both get the same score, and having gotten there through completely different test content. So it doesn't even require different administrations at this point.
Every administration is a different administration in and of itself.
Yeah.
It's really what it comes down to. But this process of equating and making all the results mean the same thing is incredibly important. And you kind of touched on that with like, you don't want a law school to have to think about the test date that you took it. And if you think about this for a moment, this would be a nightmare. Let's say you're applying to schools and you have a 160 and the school has to be in charge of tracking when you got that. Oh, wait, that was the June 2020 LSAT. That was, an easier test or a harder test that they had. If they had to do that, their job would be a nightmare because they'd have to not just look at scores, they'd have to figure out the weighted value of that score in their eyes. Oh, that test was easy, so we're not going to worry about that one. We're going to discount that. Oh, that was a really tough test. You don't want that to be happening. And I guarantee you that law school admissions officers do not want to be doing that. That's one of the reasons they accepted the results of the flex so readily at first, because they're like, does it produce the same scores? Great.
Yeah.
160 is 160. We can go forward with that. That wasn't entirely accurate, as we now know, in terms of what it was doing. A 160 was a 160, but a lot more people had them than they did previously. But ultimately, it will start to come back to a little bit more of a normalized result, and the equating will come back in line with what it should be.
Yeah, I suppose if I could revisit my answer to your question, I might revise it slightly and add a prefacing sentence, which is that LSATs are not all created to the exact same degree or level of difficulty. It's just impossible. You can't ask that many questions that many times and have everything be completely, perfectly identical. So when the test difficulty wavers or changes ever so slightly, you've got to find a way to standardize, and that's where my answer would begin, to standardize the different results from different tests so that the outcomes are identical.
Yeah. And I think that's an excellent point to kind of make. And sometimes people are like, well, why can't they be identical? And I would remind everybody that the test is made by humans.
And it uses words, and it's very, very difficult to do the same thing with the English language time and time again, or with logic. Yep. You could do this with an algebra test.
Yeah, you really could, because you could say this is the exact testing of the exact concept and this is just a version of it. Way harder to do with the English language.
Yeah.
But that kind of gives you a little bit of background when you take a look at like how the scoring scale is operating, what their goals are, why you get different conversion charts for each LSAT, what's even going on with the curve in terms of like how it breaks down. And we've talked about this off and on. We always go through this in every LSAT recap that we do. So if you've listened to that before, you're probably like, okay, they've added another layer of kind of like analysis here, but this should be something that has some familiarity with the studies that you've been doing. The question now is if we know that to be the case, what are some of the things that you and I have heard, Jon, where we're like, what? Where did that come from? Or the misunderstandings, especially that we see with new people coming into the LSAT. Yeah. And right now we're seeing a ton of new people come into this test who oftentimes are asking questions that are really basic. And I love that they ask them because it's like, seek the knowledge. If you don't know the answer, go looking for it. I'm a true believer that there is no bad question to ask, and that if you don't understand, seek it, because hopefully someone will help guide you, not only by giving you a good answer, but also pointing you in the direction of resources that really help make a lot of this make a lot more sense.
Yeah, I love it. So let's run through what we call maybe the 7 top scoring scale myths or misconceptions that we constantly encounter, and hopefully just do away with, preempt really some of the questions that this new crop of students might have, might not even know they have, and get everybody pointed in the right direction straight away.
Hit it. You start with the first one.
All right. Well, I think we've kind of covered this, but it never hurts to be thorough. One of the things that I think a lot of people are confused about is that every test is interchangeable or equally difficult, and thus the curve is always the same or roughly the same. You gave the May scoring scale example before, which, again, for a 160, you had to get 54 right. A lot of people would look at that and be like, all right, so every time I get 54 correct on a flex test or a 3-section test, I get a 160. Is that true? No.
No. I wish it was, because I suppose then I wouldn't, have to ever think about this aspect of the test every time, because it does take a lot of time to explain, but that is not the case. Each test has different questions. And so what you end up with is that it's a unique, individualized event. And even with the flex test, when people are getting different sections, those have their own versions now. And just as an aside, those complete forms are known as test forms, and they usually have a funny letter or number kind of combination. For example, the May 2020 LSAT has an identifier that's called form FL0A08. And if you look at the front of any prep test, if you have one of those from the days of old, you will see that there is typically a form listed. And that's the way LSAC tracked all these tests to say, what do we have? What are we working with?
Yeah.
And these days, I imagine their job is much, much worse because there are so many versions of each flex. But as we were talking about, the test is made by people, and even though they are running computers on this and they're giving them algorithms and analysis of the difficulty and performance, it is really hard to have them be exact. And so each test ends up with a different conversion chart, which again is what we call the curve, as we talked about. The thing is, Jon, are they pretty much all the same? I mean, are they close to the same? Are they just off by one question, or do they diverge more than that, would you say?
I'm going to see if I can answer this in a way that's relevant to what we've been talking about. I would imagine they actually distribute along a bell curve, where most of them are pretty similar, but you get some real outliers, and you get some real outliers close together. You might have one back in the old days, because again, everything has been old days except for May. You might have one where you could miss 12 or 13 to get a 170, and 6 months later you could only miss 9. That is a huge discrepancy.
Yeah, and there's tests out there on those scales with 100 questions or so where you could miss 14 to get a 170. That's
or only 8.
Yeah, exactly. It's a real outlier. At a score of 170, the range of -8 to -14 is a significant difference. And of course, what's happening there is that it's accounting for difficulty. Because as you look at that difficulty of the test, they have to do some offsetting in terms of what's occurring. That's why you get the ability to miss more questions. On that test that you could miss 14, there are some really difficult questions. There's rough logic games on that test.
Right.
And so they were like, high difficulty will loosen the scale. That also means that it goes the other way. When you see a really tight scale, they're saying, hey, this test wasn't logically as difficult. The questions weren't on the whole as hard. And as I make a big deal of every time we do a test recap, every LSAT's hard.
Right.
So they're just saying that at the really elite levels of difficulty, sometimes certain tests have a lot more difficult questions and sometimes there's fewer difficult questions. There's always going to be hard questions on the LSAT, though. That's just kind of a given.
Yeah, we actually did a deep dive into this. You definitely had a part in it. I think I probably did the majority of it. But where we took the May 2020 flex test scale when it came out and started to compare it historically to other things that we had seen. Where is it tight? Where is it loose? Where is it kind of like humdrum and normal? And we found some real stark outlier moments.
Yeah. And in fact, I think we'll end up talking about that a little bit more here as we kind of go through this. But each of these scales is very different. And that's the thing that you need to take away from this. Because a lot of people are like, oh, they're all pretty similar. No. Understanding how the scale works, what can happen on your particular test, looking at past historical scales and trying to understand and predict them as we do is a really important process of understanding this particular test. And if you want to look at something that kind of shows that variance over the time, we actually have a really cool article in our free LSAT help area, which is at powerscore.com/LSAT/help. And then it's the correct targeted .cfm is the link there. But just look for correct and incorrect LSAT scores. And typically that pops up at the top of the search that is out there. And that'll show you all the past scales and how they jumped around at each score point in like 10-point increments.
Yeah, I think if I ever need to find that, and I find it quite often that I do need that page, I think I usually Google something like LSAT historic answer counts or something, and that'll send it to you as well.
I know I do correct and incorrect.
Okay.
And I get there.
Well, it's nice to know it's findable by various routes.
Yeah, you put in LSAT, correct and incorrect, and answer, and all of a sudden it's like, bang, it'll pop up.
It's a cool page, though, because you can look back for 5-point increment scores. I think from 150 is where we start that, up to 180, for years and years and years, and just see how much these scales differ from test to test to give a given result. This is simply what happens when you've got a predetermined bell curve of percentiles that you need to conform to. If you need more people up near the top or more people near the bottom, you've got to adjust the raw conversion. That's what this is.
Yeah, and by the way, they're not making a whole bunch of tweaks to these scoring scales after the fact. They know beforehand by using experimental sections how people are going to perform. So when we talk about the experimental section in the next couple episodes here, we'll go into this a little bit more deeply and talk about that aspect of it.
Yeah.
But it's not that they're doing this after the fact. The way the scoring scales work is they're largely formed before anybody sits down. They know how people will perform in the collective. They don't know how you're going to perform. But as a mass of people, they're able to say, all right, this is what we expect to see. And they can make some tweaks afterwards, but I don't think they really have to do that a whole lot.
Well, buddy, that is a perfect segue into the second myth that I think we should tackle. You want it?
Yeah, let's start off with it. So one of the things that I often see is that people are talking about how the people around them are affecting their score. And there's a belief that the scoring scale, the curve itself, depends entirely on how people taking the test on the same day that you did performed during that administration. Literally, the idea that you're competing against the other people, on that day. It used to be in the same room and maybe will be again at some point. I won't count on that, though. But this is a huge myth because you're not actually competing against the people taking the test at the same time as you or during the same test administration. So they're not your enemy. You don't have to exult when someone else fails and be like, you screwed up. That's going to help my score. It does not. You are competing against history.
Yeah.
You're competing against those people who took experimental sections in the past and how they performed on it, because that's what predicts to the people who make this test how they think you will perform. So that's a huge point because it means that the other test takers aren't your enemy. The people from the past several years who took these experimentals are more your enemy.
I've got so many funny anecdotes from the old days of in-person collective testing where I'd hear from students and they say things like, oh God, I talked to some people afterwards and everybody there knew more than I did. Everybody there was so sharp or so prepared. They took classes and had tutors and I just bought a book. I'm doomed. This is going to be... like, no, it doesn't work like that.
Yeah, and people would say to the extreme, well, what if everybody gets a 180? And I'm like, they're not gonna. That's the first thing. It's not going to happen. So I understand the extremity of your example, but technically that would be within the allowable limits of what occurred. I'm sure they'd be like, everybody just got a 180. We need to take a look at what happened.
Yeah.
But if it was a legitimate thing, the test would say that it's acceptable for those results to all be put out. And I think that's, of course, one of the reasons this year that when we started to see a lot of 170, 175 level scores, LSAC said this is within the acceptable boundaries and parameters of what we think we can see. So it is not about the people who are taking it on the same day as you. It is about the people who took it in the past and who took those experimental sections that ultimately led to your test.
Yeah. By the way, your reference to everyone getting a 180 really has me chomping at the bit to do our experimental section episode now, because that is a very interesting talking point as to how they know everyone won't get a 180.
That's exactly right. It also means that you're kind of hoping that people in the past who took experimental sections didn't do that well on them.
That's right.
Drive it down like, oh, this is tougher. You don't want a bunch of people to just go crush experimentals and they're like, oh, these are easy when they're actually not. But the other thing that kind of connects to that is a lot of times people say, what are the percentiles for these, that I'm seeing? Is this percentile that I see for the LSAT that I took? No, because you're not competing against the people who took this test on the same day or the same dates, the same period as you. You're not actually looking at percentiles that relate to that test group. In fact, the way LSAC works is that they use a 3-year rolling pool for the percentages. So a lot of times what you'll see is these are the percentages from 2017 to 2020. And then the next year, it's 2018 to 2021, and it keeps on doing that. That gives them stability, means that any kind of spike that they see is getting absorbed into the percentile pool. But it's also a reflection that it's not about the individual test. These are collective exercises. They're not worried about an individual test. They're looking at the entire pool. Again, part of the reason when they started to see some early high scores, they said, well, later on, we'll see an offset to that. That was their expectation. That didn't entirely come true.
Mhm.
So as you look at that, that really is kind of an important thing. Individual tests can have a non-normalized look to their outcomes. It doesn't have to conform to a bell curve. You just need all the tests collectively to kind of look like a bell curve.
Right.
But no individual test is going to be an exact bell curve. It's kind of like the compilation of all of them, and that's why they do it this way.
Yeah, I think a fundamental misunderstanding among a lot of test takers here is them really underestimating just how much data LSAC has on the content that's being tested before it's being given to you, the listener. They have run this stuff through multiple passes, typically, of other people. So they've got a really good sense of just how hard each test is going to be, what the percentiles on the curve are going to look like before it ever kind of pops up on your screen. And that's why they can set these curves, by and large, in advance.
Yeah, I can't remember if it's in the Logical Reasoning Bible or the Logic Games Bible, but years ago I had read this quote by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who was writing in Sherlock Holmes. And Holmes, in one of the stories, had said, we can't predict what an individual will do, but we can predict what the collective mass will do.
Mhm.
And that word collective, I've used it a bunch of times already tonight, and that's because it's all about that. It's never about the individual. It's about the group of people.
Yeah, it's reminiscent of an old George Carlin line, which was that a person can be smart, but people are stupid.
I've heard you say that before.
Yeah, I love that line.
Well, you know how mob dynamics work, and that's obviously a little bit different than how a person would work. People in groups tend to act very differently, but
Yes,
it
they
also
do.
means they're very predictable. And that's what LSAC is able to say, is we can see what the mass of people are going to do, and we have tons of data on the overall picture. Let's move on to the next
I'm
one.
picturing England last night as a good example of
Oh my
like
God.
the individuals who, versus the mob. I don't know what that guy's going to do, but I know there's going to be a fight in that pub. That's kind of what last night.
That was unfortunate the way that game ended, because I'm an England supporter. And it was unfortunate what happened after the game. In fact, unfortunate is the wrong word. It was absolutely terrible.
Tragic, man.
Yeah, well,
Sorry, I didn't mean to go there, but that's just the first thing I thought of, is like mob mentality.
And they saw it coming even before the game, when people were trying to storm in and kind of break through and scaring people and families that were at the game. It was just a bad situation from beginning to end.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on from that unfortunate scenario.
While I'm depressing you. Myth number 3.
Yeah. So here, you tell me what your opinion of this, Jon, is. This is something that I often hear, is that depending upon the time of year, typically, that the curve is predictable, that June has a specific type of curve, and then August has a different type of curve. November will have a certain type of curve in a consistent way. Is this true?
Largely not. You'll notice I qualified it very slightly. If you hadn't used the word typically, I would have said no. So I'm paying very close attention to the details here, because this is a slightly squirmy answer. Can you look at an individual test date and guess its curve based on its calendar? No. Is there a slight variance historically over time with a big enough sample of Junes versus, say, Septembers versus what in the old days was December? That does show a very slight degree of difference.
It does. And what was that difference?
We're using, let's say, June as the old baseline. I think the curve in September, October was typically just under a point or so, around a point looser. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And then by the end of the year, by the old December date, and again, these were the only 3 tests, by December, I think it had loosened to about 1.5 compared to June.
Yeah, and I think that was a reflection of certain things that they saw over time and some of the characteristics of the test-taking group. June often is a very motivated group that has studied harder, and the performance on that test tended to be pretty good. It didn't mean that the test was any harder. It just meant that a lot of times that's what was happening with the scaling on that. And of course, that wasn't consistent. It's not like every test lined up that way.
No.
And if you're thinking, all right, I'm going to take the test later in the year, that applied to the old, really the 4-scored section test. In the Flex, we can't see it yet.
Mm-hmm.
They just have not released anything more than the single test that has gone out there. We're hoping for another test sometime soon, but that just hasn't happened yet. So there's no way to know what's going on with the Flex. And after what's happened in the last year, I don't know that I would expect a lot of loose scales, although LSAC can argue and I think has proven that when they said they weren't going to change the scales, they didn't. So it probably will just continue to go forward consistently as is.
Yeah, I think so too. Let me touch on a point here, Dave, because I think an astute listener may have just picked up on what sounds at a glance like maybe a contradiction. Wait, if the scales are set in advance, why does June ability matter? And the scales are largely set in advance, mostly set in advance, but they do make adjustments after the fact because it's a new set of inputs, it's a new set of data. So if they find that people did, say, just a bit better or a bit worse, they can tweak the scale very slightly at certain points along it. And that would be about the extent that you would see maybe a point to a half a point down, like up or down. But that's why you might see slight variations over a time of year based on the ability of the audience at that point. But it doesn't mean that they're creating everything after the fact reactionary to you and your peers. It's almost entirely done in advance.
This is also coming from a period of time when there were essentially 4 tests a year.
Yeah.
4 versions of the test that were given. There were others because there were international tests and Sabbath day tests and things like that. But that was just 4 main administrations. On the typical flex, they have already passed 4 test versions after the first 2 to 3 hours.
Yeah, by lunch on Saturday. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're talking about such a proliferation of test forms these days that it is hard to say exactly what will happen going forward. But I do know that when they look at the testing pool over the course of the year, early on, and by early, I mean that kind of June, July, that summer period, the typical results are really good because they've got a lot of people who've been preparing for a while and who are highly motivated to apply at the beginning of the window. And then they tend to drop as time goes on over the course of the LSAT testing year.
Yeah, perfect. I just wanted to clear that up if anybody was like, wait, which is it? Is it entirely predetermined or is it in some way reactionary to the group? It's 95-5 predetermined, let's say.
Yeah, we said before they kind of know and then they can make tweaks afterwards.
Exactly, yeah.
So let's go to the next myth that we have out there, which is the curve is a predictor of how you or any given person will perform. What's your thought on that?
I mean, again, obviously not. There are very few things about an individual test that you could look at from almost across the room, like, oh, this is a hard test, this is an easy test, and then point to a person and say it's going to affect them in some predictable way.
That's exactly right. And what I often say to people is that, again, this individualized experience means that no matter what you think is going to happen on the whole or what the curve says to you about the whole of the performance, it can really be completely washed away by your own particular strengths and weaknesses. And certainly people who've listened to this podcast regularly know that I like to talk about gambling and the LSAT casino. And to me, I love the fact that there's an intersection between those two ideas because let's just say you have a test that we'll use a flex scale, which would be roughly the same going forward with the new 3+1 format we'll see in August. Mm-hmm. And you could miss 8 questions to get a 170 on this scale. I can look at another test and say, well, I could also miss 8 questions on that test to get a 170. Does that mean that the 2 tests are really comparable? Maybe on the whole they are as we look at the group of people, but to me individually as a test taker, they can be 2 entirely different experiences with 2 very different outcomes. And here's why. Because each test taker has their own set of strengths and weaknesses. Mm-hmm. And some tests are going to be better for one person and not as good for another person. To use a really simple example, let's say that I am great at conditional reasoning, but I'm terrible at causal reasoning. And I get an LSAT, both of them are -8 to get a 170, and that's what I'm shooting for. And the first LSAT is just loaded with conditional reasoning. Mm-hmm. And this happens sometimes where they really just go hard on conditional, causality's not so much. Well, that's a great test for me because I'm great at conditional reasoning. Now, I'm like, oh, wow, okay, so that worked out well. Then I go to take the next test, also -8. And still, my strengths and weaknesses are the same. Great at conditional, not so great at causal. But this test goes the other way. It goes light on conditional reasoning. There still will be some because every test has it. But it goes heavier on causality. Now, all of a sudden, I'm in a situation where this test isn't good for me, even though the scale is telling me that these two tests are the same, quote unquote. My results could be significantly different. I could be 173 on the conditional heavy test. I could be 167 on the causal reasoning test. And guess what? The score banding used by LSAC would say to me, oh, it's the same. It's all good. Those two scores are within the standard error of measurement of your so-called 170 ability. It's rough.
It is rough. Yeah. I mean, you stretched it to the extent of that score band, but it does. I mean, it's true. I'll take it one further. In fact, if you extrapolate this to really any difference in experience, you start to see the individual variance, the individual strengths and weaknesses come out. Take the exact same test and just reorder the sections. That's going to actually lead to a different outcome for most people. Reading comp first, reading comp last. I guarantee you it changes something.
Or, maybe this is the test with the really hard logic games. One of them, it's first, and that kind of like psychically scars the person taking it, versus the other one where it's last, and all of a sudden they're like, okay, they get to it and they already feel good about the other two sections.
Yeah. It's funny you bring up games. I was actually thinking that in terms of templates. A test with, say, 3 or 4 games where templates are really useful. It doesn't mean much to me because I don't really do templates much. But for somebody out there who's just banking on templates as their go-to, that's a world of difference from a test where no templates are really viable.
Well, I love templates.
All right.
You and I both know from talking about the way we solve games that it's largely the same, but we often differ on this point. So I'll be like, no, I just made the templates because I like information. Mm-hmm. I like to see what's happening. I like certainty. And you are a little more freewheeling when it comes to that.
Yeah, I was going to say this has turned a bit confessional. I don't mind it.
We've said this before.
I'm going to lay down on this couch.
We've actually talked about this point previously about some of the differing ways in which we take the test.
Yeah.
And I love templates because I always feel like I am getting information by writing it down. And of course, it doesn't mean I'm templating every game. I'm not showing all the possibilities. I'm only doing it when it makes sense to me, which is when I think I can learn something useful. So, but sometimes people will disagree on what that point is. I might think it's here. You might think it's there. We both end up doing well on the section. And that's really what matters. We do it individually according to our own abilities.
And our own experimentation and histories with it. I know what I can get away with. You take it from a slightly different thing because it suits you better.
Yeah. As long as it works out for each of us individually, it doesn't matter. And that's sometimes why people will say, well, I don't want to do this. I want to read the question stem first, for example. I'm like, if that works better for you, do it.
Yeah.
I'm not going to kind of like be an apostle to, you've got to read the stimulus first. If somebody's telling me it's not working for me, you have to find what works best for you.
Yeah, but back to this fourth myth, and this might be a final point, or it might actually spur something else. It also speaks to the difficulty, the personal difficulty that you and I have in assigning curves based on individual reports of a test. We've gotten really, really good at predicting what the curve of tests will be, but we can never do it based on a single person's experience. So in the same way that the curve won't tell you individually how you're likely to perform necessarily, how you feel you're performed isn't necessarily representative of the curve.
Great point. I'm really glad you brought this up because in some respects, when we talk to individuals about their test experience, I think we filter out certain things that we hear. Yeah, about the difficulty. And a great example of that is that someone will go take a test, it feels hard, and they're like, that was the hardest test ever. It's going to have a really loose curve. And I'm like, it was hard for you, but whether or not LSAC thinks that it's hard overall, that's a different thing. And a lot of times in these post-test conversations that we've had and in the predictions that we make, we're trying to filter out kind of like that hyperbole and the kind of like extreme emotional reaction. And sometimes I'm like, let's get to kind of like the more direct elements of the test, like your section order or things like that, because that will start to tell me maybe how you were affected. Oh, you're not good at logic games and it was the first section. That might have colored your view of everything else as it went through.
Yeah, it's hard to filter out the emotion, frankly, but that's what we have to do if we want to make a universal assessment of what's likely to happen that affects everyone. It's tricky.
Yeah. It's also one of the reasons that I tell people when they are taking tests to try to predict the curve themselves.
Always.
Not at the very end on the real LSAT for the first time. I now feel it is -9. Do it every single time to see how good or how bad you are, because it actually is a really useful metronome to kind of keep track of how things are working. Oh, I'm getting it right. I'm getting it right. Oh, I was off by 3. Why was I off by 3 in my estimation of what the scaling would be on this? It is really useful to be able to do that because you start to understand how you are actually personally relating to each test, which is incredibly important because it's all about you. If you're a test taker, you really shouldn't care about anybody else. You should care about what you think. It's always nice to get confirmation where somebody's like, that game was hard to me too. But you should already know that it was hard because you've prepared to that point where you understand difficulty in that way.
Yeah, you have the context to make an informed choice based on your own experiences. That's useful. So I'm glad you brought that up too. It's great advice.
Yeah, I think it's a great point too. Let's move on to number 5. And this is
Okay.
one I think that you can speak with a lot of authority on.
Uh-oh.
Here's the myth. The question is the curve proportional from top to bottom? Meaning that if you have a loose curve at the top, let's say you could miss 10 questions to get a 170, is that looseness going to transmit all the way through the scale? Or alternately, let's say you had a really tight curve at the top, -6 to get a 170. Is that tightness at the top going to kind of convey all the way through the scoring scale down to 160, 150, 140, and so on?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's one I see a lot, and I wonder if part of this is perhaps the genesis of it is born out of the fact that the bell curve itself, if you just look at the shape, is largely symmetrical. The top and the bottom look a lot alike. That hump in the middle tends to be mirror imaged along the X, or along the Y. So why would it be then the case that the answer to this, and the reason it's a myth, is that the curve isn't proportional, or the scaling isn't proportional, say for the top 10 points versus the bottom 10 points? And the answer is that difficulty hits different people different ways. What's hard for the people at a 165 and up, I mean, I'm sure it's incomprehensible for the people lower. So that's not the sort of thing. The people at a 125, let's say.
Okay.
If you're missing questions at 170, I mean, again, unless you just get lucky, I don't think you're getting those same questions right at a 122.
No, I would agree with you on that.
I hope that doesn't sound too insulting to any group.
No.
Okay. But the reason why is, again, where the difficulty exists on a test is going to have a slightly more narrow impact at various levels for various people. We talk about this sometimes in the latest test reviews, actually, the scaling reviews that we did. We were like, look, we don't think this is going to move at a point at 170, but we do think this would actually move at a point at 160.
Yeah, and before you go further on this, because I know that you have a great example in hand that kind of shows how this works, I want to kind of like follow up on that idea of different scoring levels and performance. The way I often think about the LSAT and how it's put together is it's easy to see it as, 75 questions. And say that's what you have. But a lot of times what I think to myself is there are questions for each score level that are going to be challenging, and they're going to be the separator questions. Like there's a series of questions that are going to separate, say, a 175 through the range to 180. And so those are going to be really challenging questions. Obviously, part of it's the kind of like the compilation of everything in fatigue. But there's always some really brutal questions where it's like not many people got those right. And yeah, sometimes people get them right randomly, but they know that at a really high scoring level, these questions are separators. But there's questions like that at every group. There's the questions that separate then the 170s from the 175s, the 160s from the 170s, the 150s from the 160s. And so what happens is, as you look at that, what we end up seeing is islands of difficulty and different levels. Let's just focus on those questions that I would say are the separators between 170 and 180.
Okay.
Let's say that on a particular test, none of them are overly brutal. They're all going to be tough, but they're not overly brutal. That is going to help contribute to a tighter scale. So they're going to say, well, you should be getting a lot of these right if you're going to prove that you're at that scoring level. Now compare that to a different test where the separator questions in that 170 to 180 range are really rough. There's a bunch of them that are just ultra challenging. Well, that's probably going to loosen the scale up. And a lot of times when you and I are making predictions, we're looking at this as one element where we're trying to figure out exactly how many really tough questions were there. Now, as you said, let's say somebody's not scoring well on this test and they're struggling and they're in the 120s. All those questions are going to look tough to them. Right. They're going to miss the majority of them. So they don't see the levels of difficulty. And as you rise further on the scale, you start to see those. But it's also one of the reasons that we have said when we talk about where difficulty sits inside the section, a lot of times, and they're changing this slowly, but it's still largely true. In the first 10 questions in, say, logical reasoning, there's more easier questions relatively than difficult ones.
Sure.
You better get those right. Because if you want to score a 170, you cannot miss the easy questions because you know there's going to be some hard ones down there. So this proportionality depends upon the islands of difficulty. Because we talked about it at 170, you can do the same thing at 160. You could have a 170 level set of questions that is actually not overly difficult, but then you get to your 160 to 170 grouping, and maybe there's a bunch of really tough questions in that band. So what does that do to scales? You said the proportionality isn't there. Give us an example of how things move around.
Well, my favorite and the most recent example of this is probably the May 2020 test that we've touched on a few times here. The scale was loose, but not unprecedentedly, not wildly loose at the top. You could miss 9 on that flex test, May 2020, for 170. That's about minus 12 on the old 4-section test, which that happens. I think in the last 5 years, there have been at least 2 tests that were that loose, or even looser.
Not uncommon at all.
Not uncommon. But as you start to move down the scale, interestingly enough, it really gets historically loose. So I'll give you 160, for example. It's a number you used already, but as a reminder, you had to get 54 right on the May test out of 76 to get a 160. That translates into about 71 to 72 correct on a typical test. That number in the last 10 years has only been nearly matched 3 times. Nearly, yeah. 3 tests you had to get 72 right. So to be able to get 71 converted right was, again, historically unprecedented over a decade. That's how tight it was. How loose it was, rather, at 160. Apologies. But where things really kind of flipped on their head, if you're thinking it's getting looser as you go down, no. It was historically tight around a 131, which is a number you also used. You had to get 21 right in May for a 131. That's about 28 on a typical test. Only one test that I think we even have record of, June 2005, was that tight, required that many correct to get a 131. So amazing how that scale changes, again, comparatively, historically, at the different outcome points along it.
Yes. And just so everybody's clear on what we're doing, we're taking the 76 question May 2020 test, and then we're basically adding a conversion to get it up to like 100 question test, because that's what all the historical scales are. So that's the typical, that 4 section.
Every conversion chart we have but May is built around 100, 101 questions. So you've got to do this conversion if you want to make comparisons. But when you do the comparisons off the conversion, it's amazing where May is, again, kind of a historic outlier in both directions. Loose in the middle, tight at the bottom, normal-ish at the top.
And that's a really interesting point, because it shows that you can't say, oh, this had a loose scale, that means the whole test is loose. It does not work that way. And this is high-level nuance. I mean, it's kind of tough to explain that to somebody who's like, I didn't do well, or I'm, I don't know how I did. They don't want to hear that. But it's something to know in kind of like the cold, hard light of day, where you're able to say, all right, this is actually how it works. So the non-proportionality element is something that you have to account for. If you're after the test and you're like hearing about how hard the test was, and the scale's loose, and you're like, well, that means for the 160 that I'm shooting for, or the 155, it's going to be super loose. Not necessarily. You have to look at the test and think, how did you feel about it? And that goes in all sorts of different directions. If you're hearing about like, oh, this one was easy and it's going to have a really tight scale, and you're like, oh my God, that's going to hurt me. That doesn't necessarily translate. You don't know that for sure.
Yeah, that May test was obviously very difficult for people at 155 and above. That's where the scale is so loose. But there were some, I don't want to call them gimmies, but there were some questions that almost everyone got right a little lower down the scale. So you had a really mixed bag on that test.
Yeah, the logical difficulty of the lower questions wasn't as bad.
Right.
And so they expected you to get more of them right.
That's better put. Well done.
This is why I do what I do.
Well, I'd like to think it's teamwork, but you pretty much just went quick, end to end.
It's a good conversation, man. I feel like, this is the kind of thing where I enjoy talking about this, because I know so many people misunderstand how it works. And sometimes when you get that information that makes it clear, it's like the light bulb goes on and you're like, I don't I need to be more careful after a test in terms of reading what people have said or their perception of it. It's also one of the reasons that we have said many times that the comments that you see online, we downplay, and they're not as important or as useful to a lot of people as they may think at first, because what's happening with one test isn't necessarily what's happening for a different person with that same exact test.
Yeah. It's a shame because an individual's experience is obviously as important as anything could be to that person, but it's hardly empirical for what we try to do for the collective. It's just tricky.
Let's move to the next one,
All right.
number 6.
On 6, perfect.
The next one is that having one really hard section or one super hard game or reading comp passage within a section is going to change the conversion chart, ultimately the scaling, and have a big effect on the overall outcomes. What's your thoughts on that?
It can. I have 2 thoughts on this, actually. Number 1, the test always has built-in offsets for various things. So one really hard game preceded by, say, 3 fairly medium to low-level difficulty games probably won't have an effect. So there's that. You have to really take these things in context. An individual moment isn't enough.
Let me just interject here before you get to the second point. We say this all the time, and especially when people are like mad that we didn't like loosen the scale up on our predictions. They're like, no, that's not -8, it's -9. And
but
I'm
that
like,
shredder game, it's like,
yeah, the shredder game. I'm like, let me remind you that the first 2 games weren't that tough, relatively speaking, and you got to that last game with 10.5 minutes. Yeah, it was a harder game, but there were offsets.
Yeah.
And that offsets point is a really important one. LSAC released some data years ago about the various super prep tests, and they included an overall difficulty rating, kind of like through the starring system that they used. And one of the things that I found really interesting was back when there were 2 logical reasoning sections on the test, was seeing how they balanced out.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times there was a 5-star scale they used, so the average was around 3 stars. And usually you'd see like if one of them was 3.05, the other one would be 2.95. One was like 3.15, and guess what? The other LR, the difficulty was 2.85.
2.85, yeah.
They naturally offset, and they were doing it with 2LR, and it was easy to see because we could combine them and the comparison was really stark. But they can do that with the whole test. And in fact, there's data that show that they do that as well. So if you go and look at a test that has a really tough logic game section, a lot of times you'd see another section on that test that offset it by being easier. They were going for an overall level of difficulty, not the same level of difficulty with each section each time. So your offset point, obviously excites me. And I immediately wanted to make mention of that because that's something to really think about. People are like, oh, logic games was so tough. That's going to really be a loose scale. I'm like, well, how was the rest of the test? Let's talk about that because that's what will give us context and perspective on seeing what happens with the scaling.
Yeah, that averaging out idea is interesting. If they're going for an average of 3 stars, did you ever see any like 4-2 splits or 5-1?
No. Never got that much. They were all rotating around the mid-level point, and I think maybe they got to 3-2 at most, which for, test making purposes is a nice band that you want to be in. But it was never like, okay, here's a logical reasoning that was 4-star difficulty. Nobody would finish it.
Right.
that would be the problem. And then if you had a 2-star difficulty one, everybody would finish it.
Yeah, I was going to say, unless you let them use all the leftover time from the 2-star.
Yeah, it has to have that ability to create separation. You cannot have a test where one of the sections is 5-star and another section is 1-star because it will give you completely skewed results.
Well, what's interesting about that is it speaks to the second point that I was going to make, which, again, to reiterate, is that difficulty hits different levels of ability in different ways. That one really tough game might have a big impact on people who are used to going perfect in games. But it might not matter at all to people who were only ever going to do 3 games in the first place, or who could barely get through half. So this is, again, another one of those measures of individualized moment of difficulty, even objectively agreed upon moment of difficulty on the test, may not necessarily do anything to the curve because it depends on the context and the type of person at various curve levels.
That's exactly right. And that actually plays into the 7th and final kind of myth that we have here, which is
my favorite one, by the way.
Is it, John? Is it the fact that it is terrible luck to get a particularly hard LSAT or a really hard section of something like really tough LR, really tough reading comp, or really tough games, or even a really tough game itself. Is that a bad thing?
Yeah, the short answer is no. I've heard from people sometimes where they'll look at a test like that September 2016 test or something, and there's either it's developed its own reputation, or they'll see the curve in advance and be like, oh God, -13. What kind of hell? What kind of fresh hell is this? And it means it's going to be hard, but it doesn't mean it's going to be hard for you. And again, it does mean a looser curve or looser scale. You can miss more. There is more allowance. There are more, again, mistakes that are available to you without penalty if the test itself for the whole is tougher or the scale itself is looser. So no, I tend to look at, again, personally, I tend to see it as, if I'm good at something, give me the hardest possible version of it, because I'll still succeed more than the people around me. And it comes with this safety net, this buffer of more allowance of mistakes.
That's exactly right. I mean, you have to remember that when you look at these curves, these conversion charts, they are designed to offset the difficulty. So a really hard test gets a looser curve. A so-called easier test gets a tighter curve. It's supposed to create really the same results. That's the equating process, which ultimately goes back to that bell curve and normalization. Again, we've talked about how individually anybody can be penalized by this. It can be good for you or it can be bad for you, but be aware of how it's actually working.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes people come out and they're like, oh my gosh, that game was so hard. I'm like, this could be a good thing for you.
Yeah.
As you said, if you're a person who only does 3 games and game 4 was brutal and you started to read it and realize, oh, it's super tough, and just went back and worked on the other 3 that you had, maybe this curve being looser is going to be fantastic news for you. This is why you have to be really careful about listening to other people after the test, because their opinions are their opinions. It's the collective that actually makes the difference here. And it is interesting because I'm of the opinion that, and I've said this many times talking about scoring, I'd much rather see a harder test with a looser scaling on it. That would be really good. And part of the reason is this, is I think that because the LSAT, especially went back when it was, 5 sections long, is such a fatiguing event that even if you gave most people 100 questions that were not of high difficulty, they'd still miss some because of just human error, lack of focus at a moment, fatigue, all these kinds of things. So that on those tests, you don't have as much wiggle room.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have as much kind of a cushion there. That's why, to me, I've always liked the harder tests. So when people start saying, well, this test was hard, I'm like, this is not necessarily a bad thing. We need to figure out what kind of difficulty it was and how it affected you personally. And that isn't to say sometimes people are like, I'm terrible at reading comp and this section just clearly knocked me out. I did not do well. I'm like, all right, that's going to happen. But barring a scenario like that, that's so specific, you can't automatically say, oh my gosh, it was hard, therefore the whole thing was bad. That's not how this works.
Yeah, I mean, you can quantify this to a degree. Let's say whatever your target score is, the average scale for that is whatever it is, and you get a harder test that's going to soften it by 2. If the test itself only is hard enough to make you miss one more question, you win. You actually come out a point ahead. If it's hard enough to make you miss 2 more questions, nothing changed. So, and if you can perform at your normal level, you just gain 2 points.
And this is really what preparation is all about, is learning where those strengths and weaknesses are, looking at tests, kind of like understanding how they move the scoring scales around in these conversion charts, and knowing what's true and what's not true about the scoring scale. Because you start putting all that information together and you become a very powerful, well-armed test taker to understand, how is this affecting me? Because as I've already said, it should always be about you and your personal relationship to how the test is working. Use the information that other people will talk about difficulty or what they thought was hard, to confirm your views, but don't use it to dictate your views.
We make this point a lot and this is going to be a plug, as you'll see, Dave, and endorse, I imagine, when we do these crystal balls and we talk about what people should prioritize and study. We're doing it in part based on the frequency of appearance and what we expect to be there, but we're also doing it in part for the opportunity to distinguish yourself in ways that most people fail to. If you're better at a certain type of numerical distribution game than the people you're competing against, not on the test, but for that seat in law school, and that type of game appears, you've just given yourself a huge advantage. You've given yourself a real chance to shine.
Which reminds me, John, of something that we forgot about of the LSAT
That was
world.
I forgot about it too.
Same thought right now.
Yeah.
For those of you who are taking the August LSAT, we are in fact doing a crystal ball on July 25th.
That's right.
I believe that's at 8 p.m. Eastern time. And that is free to the public. So if you go to our website and go into the LSAT pages, you find the free seminars. You could sign up for that. And once again, we're doing exactly the same thing that we did last time. Everybody can attend for free. It's open to the general public. After we are done, it will not be posted publicly. It will only be posted for PowerScore students. So be there, be a PowerScore student, or miss out on it entirely. And if you are aware of what's been going on recently, you know that when we did this for the June LSAT, we predicted the LSAT they would use, and we were right. So I'm not guaranteeing that we're going to do that again. I'm not totally sure yet. We still have 2 more weeks. I got some data to sift still.
Yeah.
But I feel like we'll be close.
I got to make it out of Mexico, so I'm not making any promises.
Yeah, you need to come back, man. I don't want to have to do it alone. It's more fun to do it with you.
All right. I'll see if they'll let me record from a Mexican prison.
The answer is no.
Wi-Fi is spotty.
Cutting in and out.
Yeah.
Anything to add about the scoring scale or any of these myths that we just talked about?
I suppose the one final point I'd make to maybe put some bookend to this or take us full circle is if some of this is news to you, great. If some of these are questions you hadn't thought to ask, great. If you knew some of this too, the point of all of this really is trying to dispel with anyone who's operating on either incomplete or bad information. And I suppose the advice I'd leave someone with as they wander off into the LSAT ether is continue to ask questions, continue to seek out information, but make sure you go to reliable sources for it. This information is rife out there and dangerous, frankly. So if you're unsure, I can guarantee you that Dave and I know what we're talking about and will not steer you astray. But be very careful not only where you go to get information, but that it's trustworthy.
That's a great point, because if you read some of the forums that are out there, I see misinformation being disseminated constantly.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about politics. I'm talking about the LSAT here. And it's constant kind of like, nope, that's not accurate. Nope, that's not accurate. And I could probably spend 10 hours a day, writing responses that are like, that's not entirely the way that it works, but we just don't have time for that. So be careful about who you ask and who responds, because it does make a difference. There are, unfortunately, a lot of myths and rumors floating around. Hopefully we've dispelled a whole bunch of them today and that this was useful. But again, the more you know, the more powerful of a test taker you will be, and what you don't know will hurt you. So if something's unclear, feel free to ask us or listen to this again and make sure that you do understand it. John, any final thoughts beyond that?
No, that was perfect. That's exactly what I wanted to leave people with, so thank you.
Fantastic. Well, I've enjoyed this one. And if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it in the world. And if you've enjoyed it, please leave us a comment. We'd love to read those, and a rating as well. And if you have any questions, we'll probably do a mailbag at some point this summer. You can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of John and myself, we've enjoyed it. Hopefully, you now understand the separation of the scoring scale. Take care. Be safe.